The day father announced I was to attend the Royal Academy was the day England's fate unknowingly shifted. Not that anyone would believe it was due to me, Lady Jane Harrington, daughter of General Marcus Harrington, loyal servant to King Henry. My reputation preceded me, impulsive, imaginative, and, according to my governess, possessed of an uncanny ability to create chaos from order. Father hoped formal education might tame my wild spirit. How terribly wrong he was. "Jane, must you fidget so?" Elizabeth Fisher-Lizzie to me whispered as we sat in Professor Whitley's lecture on the ancient philosophers. My dearest friend since childhood, Lizzie was my perfect opposite, sensible, studious, and perpetually cleaning up my messes. "I'm not fidgeting," I whispered back. "I'm strategizing." The truth was, I had smuggled in several small firecrackers purchased from a traveling merchant who claimed they were popular in the Orient. My plan was simple: place them beneath the floorboards of the courtyard during the midday break, creating a small commotion that would surely cancel afternoon lessons. "Whatever you're planning, stop it immediately," Lizzie hissed, her blue eyes narrowing suspiciously. At this moment, whispers came from behind. "I heard the Crown Prince is handsome and dignified. I heard the Crown Prince is young and accomplished. I heard the Crown Prince is fluent in 3 languages. I heard the Crown Prince can pee 3 meters while standing." I sat at the front desk, listening with great interest, and couldn't help but interject. "Who spread this news? Is it reliable? Did someone actually measure it?" As soon as I finished speaking, Professor Whitley cleared his throat loudly. "Lady Jane, perhaps you'd care to share your fascinating conversation with the class?" I was just telling Lizzie how Aristotle's views on natural philosophy could benefit from practical experimentation, I replied with my most innocent smile. The professor's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Indeed. Then you should be delighted to write an extended essay on the topic. Due tomorrow." I slumped in my seat while Lizzie shook her head beside me. Another brilliant Jane Harrington plan was already going awry. The courtyard was empty during the noon meal, perfect for my excavation project, as I'd begun calling it. Lizzie reluctantly served as lookout while I pried up loose stones. "This is madness," she whispered. "We'll be expelled." "Nonsense. No one expels a general's daughter," I replied confidently, though my hands trembled slightly as I placed the firecrackers. "Besides, I'm not destroying anything. I'm conducting a scientific experiment on soil displacement." I had just finished arranging my experiment when Lizzie tugged urgently at my sleeve. "Someone's coming." We ducked behind a large oak tree as 2 men entered the courtyard, speaking in hushed tones. There was something odd about them. Their accents weren't English. Scottish, perhaps? No, something else. "The documents must be delivered tonight," one said. "The French ambassador expects them before dawn." French. These men were speaking with French accents. "England's naval plans will fetch a handsome price," the other replied with a chuckle. "Their channel defenses are laughably weak." My blood ran cold. Spies. French spies right here in the Royal Academy. I glanced at Lizzie, whose face had gone pale. "We must tell someone," she mouthed. I nodded, but as we tried to creep away, my foot caught on a root. I stumbled forward with an undignified yelp, causing both men to whirl around. "Who's there?" one called out sharply. Panic seized me. Without thinking, I grabbed the small flint and striker I'd brought for the firecrackers and lit the fuse. "Run!" I shouted to Lizzie as the first cracker exploded. What followed was utter chaos. The explosions were far larger than I'd anticipated, sending stones and dirt flying in all directions. The men shouted in alarm, and one dropped a leather pouch as they fled. Students and professors came running from the dining hall, and suddenly the courtyard was filled with shouting, confusion, and a great deal of smoke. "What have you done?" Professor Whitley bellowed as he spotted me standing amidst the destruction, suit-faced and wide-eyed. Before I could answer, the headmaster arrived, followed by several palace guards who had been patrolling nearby. They quickly discovered the dropped pouch, which indeed contained detailed maps of England's channel defenses. "French spies," I heard one guard mutter to another. "Right under our noses." The headmaster turned to me, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and reluctant admiration. "Lady Jane, it seems your unconventional methods have uncovered a plot against the crown." "I merely noticed suspicious behavior, headmaster," I replied, deciding it best not to mention the firecrackers had been placed well before the spies arrived. 2 days later, I stood before Lord Winchester, the King's Justice, as he praised my quick thinking and patriotic vigilance. Father looked on, his expression wavering between pride and suspicion as I was awarded a purse of 100 gold sovereigns for extraordinary service to the crown. "You planned this, didn't you?" Lizzie whispered as we left the royal chambers. "Of course not," I replied. "But wouldn't it be impressive if I had?" As we walked through the palace corridors, I couldn't help but think, my father may lack scholarly education, but Lord Winchester's interpretation of events was truly extraordinary. Spring turned to summer, and my inadvertent heroism was all but forgotten except by my father, who watched me like a hawk whenever court duties brought us together. I had managed to stay out of trouble, mostly due to Lizzie's vigilant supervision, but my reputation as the firecracker lady lingered. "You should be grateful," Lizzie said one afternoon as we walked through London's bustling markets. "Any other student would have been expelled, not celebrated." "I am grateful," I insisted, though I do sometimes wonder if... My words were cut short by a rough hand clamping over my mouth. I felt myself being hoisted up and thrown into what felt like a cart. I heard Lizzie scream before something hard struck my head and darkness fell. When I awoke, I was in pitch blackness, confined in what seemed to be a wooden box. My head throbbed painfully, and the air was stale. As my senses slowly returned, I realized I wasn't alone. I could hear someone breathing nearby. "Hello?" I whispered cautiously. A groan answered me, followed by a wet sniffling sound. "Lizzie?" I ventured. "No," came a male voice, congested and irritable. "And would you kindly stop kicking me?" "I'm not kicking you," I protested, though I immediately shifted to put more distance between us. "Where are we?" "Who are you?" "In a box, obviously," the voice replied, followed by more sniffling. "As for who I am, that's none of your concern." I frowned in the darkness. "Well, if we're to be boxmates, I think introductions are in order. I'm Lady Jane Harrington." "How delightful for you," he replied dryly. The box jolted violently, sending me tumbling against my mysterious companion. His coat was fine velvet, I noted, clearly not a common kidnapper. "You're a prisoner too, then?" I asked. "Your powers of deduction are remarkable," he said. "Now be quiet. I'm trying to think." "Of what?" "How to escape. Because I have several ideas involving..." "Shoo," he hissed. "Do you hear that?" I fell silent, straining my ears. Voices were approaching, rough, angry voices discussing ransoms and deadlines. "Kidnappers," my companion whispered. "They think I'm valuable." "And what about me?" I whispered back. "Collateral damage, I suspect." Fear gripped me as the reality of our situation sank in. Lizzie and I had been in scrapes before, but nothing like this. I had to think, had to find a way out. And then, as if sent by divine providence, my stomach growled loudly, followed by an undeniable urge. "Oh no," I murmured. "What now?" my companion asked irritably. "I'm afraid I'm about to express my discomfort." "What are you talking about?" Rather than answer, I shifted awkwardly, trying to minimize the inevitable. Moments later, the confined space filled with an unmistakable odor. "Dear God," my companion exclaimed, coughing violently. "Was that... did you just..." "A lady doesn't discuss such matters," I replied primly, though my cheeks burned with embarrassment. "I warned you." He continued coughing and sputtering, his breathing becoming increasingly labored. Then, unexpectedly, he slumped against me, his body going limp. "Hello?" I whispered, poking him. "Are you alive?" He didn't respond. Had I actually killed him with flatulence? Panic rising, I fumbled in the darkness until I found his face, attempting to feel for signs of life. His skin was warm, his breath faint, but present. Just unconscious, then. As I withdrew my hand, I felt something wet on his face. Mucus? The sniffling man had a runny nose. The realization that I now had a stranger's nasal discharge on my fingers made me gag. Without thinking, I wiped my hand on what I hoped was his coat sleeve. "Disgusting," I muttered to myself. The box suddenly stopped moving. I heard footsteps, then the sound of a lock being turned. Light flooded in as the lid was lifted, temporarily blinding me. Well, a gruff voice said. "Let's see what treasures we've..." He stopped abruptly. "What's wrong with him?" I blinked up at the bearded face peering down at us. "He fainted," I explained. "Weak constitution, I suspect." The kidnapper frowned. "Wake him up. Lord Barrett wants to see them both." As they hauled us out of the box, I got my first clear look at my companion and nearly fainted myself. Though his face was pale and his fine clothes disheveled, there was no mistaking the aquiline nose and distinctive auburn hair of Edward Redmond, Crown Prince of England. The prince's eyes fluttered open as we were marched through a dilapidated building. When his gaze met mine, his expression turned to one of absolute horror, as if his wife had run off with another man. "You," he accused hoarsely. "You tried to suffocate me." "I did no such thing," I protested. "It was an accident." "And then you..." His hand flew to his cheek, where my fingerprints were clearly visible in his own mucus. "Is that my..." "Did you wipe?" "I thought it was your sleeve." I hissed as our captors pushed us into a larger room. Prince Edward's face darkened to an alarming shade of crimson. When we return to court, I will personally see to it that you—" "Silence," bellowed a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek, presumably Lord Barrett. "I don't care about your lover's quarrel. I want information about the king's travel plans." "We're not lovers," the prince and I exclaimed simultaneously. Lord Barrett smiled unpleasantly. "No? Then you won't mind if we dispose of the lady after she's served her purpose." The prince's expression changed instantly. "Touch her, and my father will have your head on a pike." I stared at him, surprised by his sudden protectiveness. Perhaps there was more to the runny-nosed royal than I'd thought. The following hours were a blur of threats, negotiations, and increasingly desperate attempts at escape. I discovered that Lizzie had been taken as well, held in another part of the building. The prince, who insisted I call him Edward rather than Your Highness to maintain our cover, proved surprisingly resourceful for someone who'd been unconscious from a bad smell just hours earlier. "If we create a distraction," he whispered as we huddled in our makeshift cell, "we might be able to reach the window." "What kind of distraction?" He glanced at me meaningfully. "Well, your previous method was certainly effective." I glared at him. "Very amusing, Your Edward." "I'm serious. Your natural talents cleared a room once already." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You want me to deliberately?" "For England," he said solemnly, though I detected a glint of mischief in his eyes. Before I could respond, the door burst open and Lord Barrett entered with 2 guards. "Change of plans," he announced. "We're moving you tonight." Edward tensed beside me. This was bad. Once moved, our chances of rescue would dwindle to nothing. I had to act now. "Wait," I cried dramatically. "Before we go, I must confess something." Lord Barrett raised an eyebrow. "Confess what?" "I am not who you think I am," I said, improvising wildly. "I am a trained performer from the king's own theatrical company. Allow me to demonstrate my skills before we depart as a final request." Edward looked at me as if I'd lost my mind, but Barrett seemed intrigued. "A performer, eh? And what will you perform?" "A sacred dance," I declared. "From the distant Orient. It's said to bring good fortune to those who witness it." Barrett laughed. "Very well, entertain us. But make it quick." With all eyes on me, I began what I hoped resembled a dance. I'd once seen an illustration of Eastern dancers in one of Father's books, though my interpretation was likely far from accurate. I moved stiffly, arms extended, fingers splayed, occasionally making sharp, jerking movements that I imagined might appear exotic to the untrained eye. In reality, I looked like nothing so much as a country exorcist attempting to drive evil spirits from a barn. I stomped and twisted, making guttural sounds that I hoped passed for foreign chanting. All the while, I was inching closer to the guards by the door. "What sort of dance is this?" one guard muttered. "Looks like she's having a fit." "Silence," I commanded in my most imperious tone. "The sacred movements must not be interrupted." As I spun toward Edward, I saw him struggling to maintain a straight face. His eyes, however, were alert, watching my every move. He understood I was creating a diversion. With a final, dramatic flourish, I leaped toward the guards, shrieking what I hoped sounded like an exotic battle cry. The sudden movement startled them just enough for Edward to spring into action. He tackled one guard while I grabbed a candlestick and brought it down on Barrett's head. Chaos erupted. Edward seized a sword from the fallen guard, demonstrating that royal combat training was apparently quite thorough. I darted past the melee, rushing to find Lizzie. I found her in a small storeroom, tied to a chair, but otherwise unharmed. "Jane," she cried as I untied her. "What's happening?" I heard shouting. "I performed an exorcism dance," I explained hurriedly. "And now we're escaping with the crown prince." Lizzie stared at me. "The crown, Jane? What have you done?" "Saved us all, hopefully," I replied, pulling her toward the exit. Though I may have wiped his royal nose on his royal face. "You what?" "No time to explain." We reunited with Edward, who had somehow managed to subdue our captors and procure horses. As we galloped away from the kidnappers' hideout, I couldn't help but notice how the moonlight caught in his auburn hair, making it appear almost like burnished copper. "That was the most ridiculous dance I've ever witnessed," he shouted over the thundering hooves. "You look like a country witch trying to summon rain." "It worked, didn't it?" I called back. His laughter carried on the night air. "Indeed it did, Lady Jane. Indeed it did." Our triumphant return to court caused quite a stir. King Henry himself received us, his relief at his son's safe return evident in his embrace. The story of our escape spread quickly, though with each telling, my impromptu dance became more elegant, more strategic, and decidedly less like an exorcism ritual. Edward, to my surprise, seemed to enjoy my company after our shared ordeal. He sought me out at court functions, often to exchange barbed comments about courtiers or to reminisce about our adventure. Lizzie was convinced he was developing feelings for me, a notion I dismissed as absurd. He called me the lady who lowered the average grace of court dancers. I reminded her. That's hardly the language of love. He says these things to make you notice him, she insisted. And you always rise to the bait. That's precisely why he does it. I rolled my eyes, though secretly, I found our verbal sparring matches oddly enjoyable. Edward was quick-witted when he wasn't being insufferable, and there was something refreshing about conversing with someone who didn't treat me like a general's fragile daughter. Our unlikely friendship might have continued in this vein indefinitely had fate and my perpetual misfortune not intervened once again. It began innocently enough. The king announced a diplomatic reception for the visiting French ambassador in an attempt to ease tensions following the spy incident. Father insisted I attend, hoping my presence might remind the French of England's vigilance. Remember, Jane, he warned as our carriage approached the palace, this is a delicate diplomatic situation. Be on your best behavior. When am I not? I asked, widening my eyes innocently. Father's expression suggested he could provide numerous examples, but was too weary to enumerate them. The reception was underway when we arrived, the great hall filled with elegantly dressed nobles from both England and France. I spotted Edward near the throne, deep in conversation with a stately French nobleman. He caught my eye briefly, his expression unreadable before returning to his discussion. Lady Jane, a voice called. I turned to find Lizzie approaching, her face flushed with excitement. You'll never believe what I've heard. The French ambassador brought gifts including exotic performers from the Ottoman Empire. Dancers? I asked, immediately interested. Yes, they're to perform after the feast. They say the Sultan himself sent them as a gesture of goodwill. The feast was sumptuous, course after course of elaborate dishes designed to impress our French guests. I found myself seated far from Edward, between an elderly countess who spoke at length about her ailments and a French gentleman whose English was as limited as my French. As the meal concluded, King Henry rose to announce the entertainment. The hall fell silent as the Ottoman performers entered, men and women in vibrant silks who moved with a grace that made my sacred dance seem even more ridiculous in retrospect. Their performance was mesmerizing, their movements fluid and precise as they twisted and spun to exotic music. When they concluded, the audience erupted in applause. The lead dancer bowed deeply before the king, then spoke in heavily accented English. Your Majesty honors us. As is our custom, we invite a member of the royal household to join us in the dance of friendship. King Henry, ever the diplomat, smiled indulgently. A wonderful tradition. My son, Prince Edward, shall represent England. Edward rose, looking somewhat uncomfortable as he approached the dancers. The lead performer bowed again. And a lady partner is required. Perhaps. His gaze swept the hall, settling unexpectedly on me. The young lady in blue. All eyes turned to me. Father's face had gone ashen. Edward looked positively alarmed. I'm not of the royal household, I stammered. But you dance, yes, the performer insisted. Your reputation precedes you. My reputation? What had Edward been saying about me? With no graceful way to refuse, I found myself being led to the center of the hall. The musicians began a haunting melody as the Ottoman dancer demonstrated simple steps for us to follow. Just mirror my movements, Edward muttered as we took our positions. And please, try not to stomp like a drunken blacksmith. I'll have you know I've been taking dancing lessons, I whispered back, which was technically true though my instructor had recently suggested I might be better suited to less movement-oriented pursuits. The music swelled, and the dance began. I concentrated fiercely, mimicking the fluid arm movements and gentle steps as best I could. For a few blissful moments, I thought I might actually avoid catastrophe. Then my foot caught the hem of my gown. I stumbled forward, arms flailing like a windmill in a gale. In my desperation to remain upright, I grabbed the nearest object for support, which happened to be Edward's elegant doublet. The sound of tearing fabric was audible even over the music as buttons popped and seams split. The prince staggered under my weight, and together we tumbled into the French ambassador, who collapsed onto a serving table. Platters crashed to the floor, sending remnants of the feast in all directions. A bowl of wine punch overturned, drenching several French nobles in crimson liquid that looked alarmingly like blood in the candlelight. Sacre bleu, the ambassador cried. We are attacked. No, no, I protested, struggling to extricate myself from the tangle of limbs and tablecloth. It was an accident. But panic had already taken hold. French guards drew their swords, English guards responded in kind, and the hall dissolved into chaos. Above the din, I heard King Henry bellowing for order while Father looked as though he might expire from mortification. Somehow I still don't know how Edward managed to restore calm, convincing the ambassador that no insult had been intended. The damage, however, was done. I had created a diplomatic incident that would likely be recorded in the annals of royal embarrassments for generations to come. As the guests dispersed, Edward approached me, his torn doublet hanging awkwardly from one shoulder. "Well," he said dryly, "that was quite a performance." "I'm sorry," I mumbled, unable to meet his eyes. "I didn't mean to." "Of course you didn't," he interrupted. "You never do. That's what makes you so dangerous, Lady Jane." I looked up, expecting anger, but found him regarding me with a curious mix of exasperation and amusement. "The French ambassador thinks you were attempting to exorcise evil spirits," he continued. "Apparently, your dance reminded him of a ritual he witnessed in the colonies. He's convinced you were trying to protect us from malevolent forces." I stared at him. "You can't be serious." "Entirely. In fact, he's requested that you accompany the diplomatic mission to France next month. He believes you possess some sort of mystical protection." "And what did you tell him?" Edward's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "I told him you were England's secret weapon, unpredictable, unconventional, and utterly devastating." I couldn't tell if I'd been complimented or insulted. Perhaps both. The diplomatic mission to France was a disaster from the start. Despite Father's strenuous objections, the king insisted I attend, apparently convinced that my unique talents might prove useful. Lizzie, naturally, accompanied me as my lady-in-waiting, her practicality a necessary counterbalance to to me. Edward led the mission, along with several senior advisors and a small contingent of guards. The crossing was rough, leaving half our party seasick and the other half in foul tempers. By the time we reached the French court, I was determined to remain as inconspicuous as possible, a resolution that lasted precisely 3 hours. The incident at the French palace was not, strictly speaking, my fault. How was I to know that the corridor I wandered down led directly to the king's private quarters? Or that the small door I slipped through to avoid a guard would lead to the queen's chambers? I found myself in an opulent room filled with ladies-in-waiting, all of whom stared at me as if I'd materialized from thin air. At the center sat the French queen, eyeing me with imperious curiosity. "Who are you?" she demanded in French-accented English. "Think, Jane, think." "I am a dance instructor," I improvised, cursing my limited French vocabulary. "For the entertainment tonight." The queen's eyebrows rose. "We were not informed of any English performers." "A surprise," I said quickly. "From Prince Edward." A gesture of cultural exchange. To my astonishment, the queen seemed pleased by this explanation. "How thoughtful. Perhaps you could demonstrate your English dances?" And so, trapped by my own lie, I found myself performing yet another improvised dance, this one a hodgepodge of country reels, court steps, and movements that might charitably be described as interpretive. I jerked and swayed, occasionally adding sounds that I hoped suggested enthusiasm rather than digestive distress. The French ladies watched in stunned silence. The queen, however, nodded approvingly. "Fascinating," she declared when I finally stopped, breathless and sweating. "So primal. So unlike our formal French styles. You must remain and teach us." "Teach you?" I echoed weakly. "Yes. Tonight you will sleep in my chambers. Tomorrow we begin lessons." I stared at her in horror. Sleep in the queen's chambers? Teach French noblewomen my made-up dances? This was rapidly becoming the most absurd diplomatic mission in English history. "Your Majesty, I'm deeply honored, but..." My protest was interrupted by a commotion at the door. To my enormous relief, Edward appeared, flanked by French guards looking somewhat confused about his presence. "Lady Jane," he said, his voice carefully controlled though his eyes blazed with something between fury and panic. "There you are. We've been searching everywhere." The queen turned to him, delighted. "Prince Edward, your dancer was just demonstrating English techniques. How exotic they are." Edward's gaze flickered to me, then back to the queen. "Yes, Lady Jane is known throughout England for her unconventional style. She will stay and teach us," the queen announced. "I'm afraid that's impossible, Your Majesty," Edward replied smoothly. "Lady Jane has a rare condition that requires specific treatment available only in our quarters. Her spells can be quite alarming if not properly managed." "Spells?" the queen echoed, now regarding me with concern. "Indeed. They often manifest as strange movements, not unlike dancing. In fact, what you witnessed may have been the beginning of an episode." I fought to keep my expression appropriately solemn as Edward continued spinning his ridiculous tale. By the time he finished, the queen was practically pushing us out the door, concerned that my condition might be contagious. "A rare condition?" I hissed as he escorted me back to the English quarters. "That was the best you could devise? Would you prefer I told her the truth? That you're a general's daughter with the directional sense of a blindfolded pig and the grace of a newborn colt?" At least I wasn't hiding in the rafters this time, I retorted. Edward stopped walking, his expression quizzical. The rafters? What are you talking about? Too late. I realized my mistake. In the chaos of our kidnapping adventure, I had never told him how I knew he was crouching on the roof beams during my exorcism dance. The truth was, I had glimpsed his silhouette as I spun, recognizing the distinctive profile I'd seen earlier in our box prison. Nothing, I said quickly. Just a figure of speech. His eyes narrowed suspiciously, but he let the matter drop. The ambassador is hosting a banquet tonight. Try to stay out of trouble until then. I make no promises, I replied with a sweet smile. The banquet was a formal affair, with both English and French nobility dressed in their finest. I had worn my most conservative gown at father's insistence, delivered via a strongly worded letter that had somehow reached me before we did, and was determined to be on my best behavior. Lizzie sat beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand in warning whenever my responses to the French noble's questions became too colorful. Edward was seated at the high table with the ambassador and other dignitaries, deep in discussions that seemed far more serious than mere diplomatic pleasantries. Something's wrong, I murmured to Lizzie. Look at Edward's expression. Indeed, the prince appeared tense, his smiles forced as he conversed with the French minister beside him. Perhaps he's still upset about the Queen's Chambers incident, Lizzie suggested. No, it's something else. I had come to recognize Edward's moods over our strange acquaintance. This wasn't irritation or diplomatic strain, it was genuine concern. As the meal progressed, I noticed a sealed letter being passed discreetly to Edward. He read it quickly, his face paling before he tucked it away. Whatever news it contained was clearly troubling. When the banquet concluded and guests began moving to the adjoining hall for music, I maneuvered through the crowd until I reached Edward's side. What's happened? I asked without preamble. He glanced around to ensure we weren't overheard. Lizzie's father has been taken prisoner. What? Why? The French believe he's been sending encoded messages describing their military positions. They found letters in his possession detailed observations about French delicacies, particularly something called canard à l'orange. I felt the blood drain from my face. Canard à l'orange? But that's... I know, Edward said grimly. It's Lizzie's favorite dish. She's been writing to her father about the French cuisine. The situation would have been comical if it weren't so serious. Somehow, the French had intercepted Lizzie's innocent letters to her father, interpreting her enthusiastic food descriptions as coded military intelligence. We have to free him, I said urgently. Lizzie will be devastated if... It's not that simple, Edward interrupted. The French are demanding concessions, significant ones. They want access to the channel defenses we've been building. But that's absurd. The letters are about food, not fortifications. Try explaining that to paranoid ministers who see English spies behind every tapestry, Edward sighed. I've requested an audience with the French king tomorrow, but I'm not optimistic. I bit my lip, mind racing. There had to be a solution, some way to prove the letters were innocent without compromising England's security. And then, as if by divine inspiration, an idea formed. Edward, I said slowly, what if we gave them exactly what they want? The defense plans? Are you mad? No, not the actual plans. What if we offered? Canard à l'oranges. He stared at me as if I'd sprouted a second head. Ducks? What are you talking about? A treaty, I explained, my excitement growing. An annual tribute of canard à l'oranges from France to England. It would prove the letters were truly about food while allowing the French to save face. Edward's expression shifted from confusion to consideration. That's actually not completely insane. But it would require convincing the French king that poultry is a suitable diplomatic concession. Leave that to me, I said with more confidence than I felt. His eyes narrowed. The last time he said that, we ended up in a box together. And escaped triumphantly, I reminded him. Trust me, Edward. Please. After a long moment, he nodded. Very well. But if this fails... It won't, I assured him. After all, what ruler doesn't appreciate fine cuisine? The audience with the French king the following day was tense. Edward presented our case formally, emphasizing the cultural misunderstanding that had led to Mr. Fisher's imprisonment. I stood beside him, heart pounding as the king listened with obvious skepticism. These letters speak of plump birds ripe for the taking, the king said accusingly. If not our military positions, what could this possibly refer to? This was my moment. I stepped forward, ignoring protocol. Your Majesty, if I may explain? The king nodded, curiosity evident in his expression. My friend Elizabeth Fisher is a renowned culinary enthusiast, I began. Her passion for fine foods, particularly poultry prepared in the Oriental style, is well known in England. The plump birds she referenced are indeed the famous canard à l'oranges that your court prepares with such unparalleled skill. The king's eyebrows rose. Our ducks? She was writing about our ducks. Indeed, Your Majesty. In England, we have nothing comparable. Elizabeth was merely expressing her admiration for French culinary achievements, a sentiment shared by all of England. Edward, catching on quickly, added, "So impressed were we with this particular dish that we hoped to establish a formal exchange, a tribute, if you will, of 30,000 canard à l'oranges annually from France to England, as a symbol of our nation's friendship." 30,000 ducks? The king repeated incredulously. "A small price for peace," Edward said smoothly. "And in return, England would provide." He hesitated. "The finest English wool for Your Majesty's royal wardrobe," I supplied quickly. "Our sheep are as renowned as your ducks." A peculiar silence fell over the court as the French king considered this unusual proposal. I held my breath, acutely aware of how absurd it all sounded. Edward remained impressively stoic beside me, though I detected the slight twitch in his jaw that indicated suppressed amusement. Finally, the king spoke. "This is most unconventional. But if it resolves our misunderstanding without bloodshed, perhaps there is merit in such an arrangement." Relief flooded through me. "Then Mr. Fisher will be released?" Once the treaty is formalized, the king agreed. Though I must reduce the number of ducks to 3,000 per annum. Even France's renowned poultry farms have their limits. And so it was that the most peculiar treaty in diplomatic history was signed, all because of Lizzie's enthusiastic letters about French cuisine. When Mr. Fisher was finally released and informed of the terms that had secured his freedom, he laughed until tears streamed down his face. 3,000 ducks, he wheezed. "My daughter's appetite isn't quite that voracious." When we returned to England, our diplomatic triumph was met with bewilderment by most of the court, though King Henry seemed more amused than annoyed. My father, naturally, was less sanguine. "Only you," he said with a weary sigh, "could transform a simple diplomatic mission into a poultry exchange program." "I prefer to think of it as creative problem-solving," I replied. Edward defended our unorthodox treaty to the Privy Council, somehow making annual shipments of ducks sound like a strategic masterstroke. In private, however, he was less diplomatic. "I wanted to bring you a souvenir," he told me as we walked in the palace gardens a week after our return. "Perhaps a small trinket from Paris. Instead, you've arranged for thousands of fowl to cross the channel each year." 3,000 ducks is hardly excessive, I protested. "And besides, they're delicious." He laughed, the sound warming something deep inside me. "You are utterly impossible, Lady Jane Harrington." "So I've been told." "Repeatedly. Often by you." Edward stopped walking, his expression suddenly serious. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you. That day at the French court, you mentioned seeing me in the rafters during your exorcism dance. How did you know I was there?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain without sounding ridiculous. "I sensed your presence." "You sense me?" he repeated skeptically. "Yes. We developed a connection during our time in that box, I suppose." His lips twitched. "A connection formed by you rendering me unconscious with noxious fumes?" "Precisely. Very bonding experience, that." For a moment, we simply looked at each other, the air between us charged with something I couldn't quite name. Then Edward cleared his throat. "My father has been discussing my future," he said, his tone deliberately casual. "He believes it's time I took a wife." My heart gave an uncomfortable lurch. "Oh! Anyone in particular?" "Several candidates have been suggested. Daughters of dukes, foreign princesses, the usual assortment of suitable matches." "How delightful for you," I said, striving for a lightness I didn't feel. "I'm sure any of them would make a most elegant and accomplished queen someday." Edward studied me, his expression unreadable. "Yes, I'm sure they would. Very refined. Very proper. Very predictable." "Predictability has its merits in a royal consort," I pointed out. "Less chance of diplomatic incidents involving ducks." "True. Though significantly less chance of uncovering French spies or negotiating unprecedented treaties." I wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but my pulse had quickened traitorously. "Edward, what are you saying?" He took a step closer. "I'm saying that after much consideration, I've informed my father that I will only marry one woman." "And who might that be?" I asked, hardly daring to breathe. "The most infuriating, chaotic, brilliant woman I've ever met. The woman who wiped her hand on my face after touching my nose." I stared at him in disbelief. "You can't possibly mean me." "I don't see any other troublesome general's daughters in the vicinity, do you? But I'm completely unsuitable. I cause scandals wherever I go. I nearly started a war over poultry." Edward reached out, taking my hand in his. "Jane, do you know what my father said when I told him I wished to marry you?" He said, "Thank God. That girl will either strengthen the monarchy or bring it to its knees, and either way, it won't be boring." That's not exactly a ringing endorsement, I pointed out, though I couldn't suppress a smile. It's the highest praise he's capable of giving, Edward replied. So, what say you? Will you marry me, despite my once being known to you as Mucus Man? I laughed, joy bubbling up inside me like champagne. Only if you'll have me, despite my having been called the exorcist of the royal court. His answer was to pull me close and press his lips to mine, a most unconventional proposal acceptance, particularly in the middle of the royal gardens where anyone might see. But then, nothing about our courtship had been conventional. Our wedding was the talk of England, not least because I managed to set fire to my veil during the ceremony when it drifted too close to a candle. Edward, rather than looking mortified, simply helped extinguish the flames before continuing his vows with remarkable composure. I knew what I was getting into, he whispered as we processed out of the cathedral. Married life brought new challenges, chief among them, navigating court politics as the future queen. Many of the older nobles were scandalized by Edward's choice, convinced I would bring ruin to centuries of tradition. They weren't entirely wrong. Within a year of our marriage, I had persuaded Edward to support reforms that shocked the court. When King Henry fell ill 3 years into our marriage, Edward assumed many of his father's duties. Together, we faced crises that tested both our resolve and our relationship: famine in the northern counties, threats of invasion from Spain, and court intrigues that would have made Machiavelli blanch. Yet through it all, our unconventional partnership proved surprisingly effective. Edward provided steady leadership and diplomacy, while I contributed creative solutions and an uncanny ability to see opportunities where others saw only problems. When drought threatened crops across the kingdom, I remembered an abandoned mine near my childhood home, a place locals called Black Wind Shaft due to its constant breeze. The mine had flooded years earlier, but I convinced Edward that the water could be channeled into an irrigation system for nearby farms. The nobles laughed at the idea until it saved thousands from starvation. Suddenly, my peculiar thinking was seen as visionary rather than merely chaotic. Edward ascended to the throne upon his father's death, making me Queen of England, a role for which no amount of court training could have prepared me. Yet somehow, despite frequent missteps and occasional scandals, including an incident involving a Spanish ambassador and an unfortunately placed bowl of cranberry sauce, we managed to lead the country through a period of relative peace and prosperity. Our greatest joy came with the birth of our twins, a boy and girl who inherited their father's auburn hair and, heaven help us, their mother's penchant for mischief. While in the throes of childbirth, I did indeed scream at Edward, "Redmond, I'll kill you for this," much to the horror of the midwives and the amusement of Lizzie, who had remained my closest friend and confidant. As I held our newborns in my arms, Edward beside me with an expression of wonder and terror, a combination I knew well, I couldn't help but marvel at the unlikely path that had led us here. From explosions at the Royal Academy to diplomatic duck treaties to the throne of England, it had been a journey as improbable as it was extraordinary. As our children grew, I often told them the story of how their parents met, though I modified certain details, particularly those involving boxes and bodily functions. The tale became something of a family legend, growing more outlandish with each telling. Edward would listen, shaking his head in fond exasperation. "Your mother," he would tell the children, "has always had a unique relationship with the truth." "Not unique," I would correct him. "Creative. And besides, the moral of the story remains accurate." "And what moral is that?" he would ask, eyes twinkling. "That sometimes the most disastrous beginnings lead to the most glorious endings. And that occasionally, setting off explosions can lead to unexpected rewards." It wasn't, perhaps, the most conventional lesson for future rulers of England. But then, ours had never been a conventional story. From firecracker-wielding troublemaker to queen, my journey had been one of accidental triumphs and purposeful chaos, proof that even the most unlikely paths can lead to greatness, given sufficient audacity and a touch of extraordinary luck. And if anyone doubted the wisdom of a queen with a reputation for disorder, they needed only look at the peace treaties that line the palace walls, including, prominently displayed in the Great Hall, the Duck Treaty of 1542, which had secured decades of peace with France and ensured that the royal table never lacked for canard à l'orange. Some called it madness. We called it magic. And in the end, isn't that what the best stories are made of?